In this dialogue between Charicles and Callicratidas, it also helps to note the social position of these men. Callicratidas, who is the one who advocates boy love, was a very wealthy Athenian. He was a leading figure in the city's public life. His preference for boys did not mark him as deviant or as an outcast in any way. In fact, he is said to have excelled at all of those activities that were regarded as being masculine: political life, oratory, speech making, that is, gymnastics, and philosophy. His sexual desire for boys, instead of making him effeminate, actually confirmed his manhood. Interestingly, and by contrast, this is what happens to Charicles. Charicles, if you remember, that being the partisan of women. Charicles is from Corinth. He is a city, which is a city that is renowned for its courtesans, and it appears that his preference for women diminishes his masculinity. He is described in the Erotes, this text, as someone who exhibits, quote, a skillful use of cosmetics so as to be attractive to women. It appears that in spending so much time among women, he has himself become feminine. Interestingly, it is he in the story who is regarded as a traitor to his gender, not Callicratidas. So, analyzing this text, David Halperin has this to say about it. The sharply polarizing tendencies of Greek sexual discourse would seem to require that excessive liking for women on the part of a man be interpreted as a sign of a deviant, specifically effeminate identity. Such an outlook is plainly at odds with modern constructions of hetero and homosexuality. But before moving to our next category in Halperin's genealogical analysis, which is romantic friendship, just to do a little bit of a review to make sure that we kind of adequately understand the differences between these two other forms, that is effeminacy and pederasty versus homosexuality, right? So first, effeminacy. This has often functioned as a marker of sexual inversion or even transgenderism, but it should be noted that it's not the same as same-sex sexual object choice. In many times and places, it has been possible to be homosexual without being effeminate, or to be effeminate without being homosexual. Moreover, effeminacy at various points in time has been seen as the result of excessive heterosexuality, especially in the case of Charicles from this dialogue in the Erotes. In ancient times, men demonstrated their masculinity in the public sphere through oratorical performance, through military deeds, and through competitive business struggles. All of this was done in the company of other men. Those who opted out of the male sphere, who prioritized the company of women over that of men, like again, Charicles, they were seen as being unmanly. Those who preferred the soft option of love over the hard option of war and diplomacy were soft. The term womanizer in this period was not seen as an emblem of masculinity like it is today. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Today, the womanizer labels someone who is hypermasculine. That certainly would not have been the case in the ancient world. So, effeminacy, quite different from our modern day concept of homosexuality. And so is pederasty. Of course, pederasty refers to a male's sexual penetration of another subordinate male. The important point to note about this is that pederasty has to do with hierarchy and with power. It's not about shared pleasure. It's not about submerging or losing your identity. It's about difference. And this is a contrast with homosexuality today. And to the extent that pederasty is about erotic desire, it's generally only about the feelings of the penetrator. This is because pederasty is usually something done to someone by someone else. Pederasts may have engaged in same-sex behavior, but they were themselves not thought to be deviant. Maybe their acts were perverse, but they themselves were not. Some even interpret them as evidence of having an excessive sexuality, right? Something that was just an extension of what was otherwise a perfectly normal male sexual appetite. Obviously, this is all quite different than gay sexuality today. Okay, so moving then to our third key category, this is the idea of romantic friendship, sometimes referred to as platonic love. This is less hierarchical than pederasty. It is about egalitarian relationships. These are things that obtain between people who had a similar rank, a similar station, and a similar status. The best defense of the practice from the ancient world is Aristotle's book, the Nicomachean Ethics, which was written probably in reference or in honor of Aristotle's son, Nicomachus. The idea that Aristotle puts forward here is that true friendship, the best form of friendship, the ideal friendship, is one in which a single mind, heart, and soul are shared between two bodies. For us today, it's difficult to separate this from homoeroticism. We tend to think of these things as examples, perhaps, of latent homosexuality. But when the pre-moderns wrote about the merging of individual identities through friendship, they did so believing that this was entirely removed from the idea of erotic passion. In fact, Aristotle says that the two are impossible to combine. He says, sexual feelings can only come about through a relationship of unequals. When you have equals, sex can't come into it at all. Okay, so next up we have inversion. Inversion is different than all of the other forms. Pederasty and male friendship work within and express conventional notions of masculinity. Indeed, both pederasty and effeminacy are masculinizing in many ways. Inversion, of course, is very different because it refers to the reversal of one's gender identity, right? Masculine becoming feminine. There are some overlaps between inversion and the kinedoi. That is to say that they both enjoyed being penetrated by other men, and they're both seen to possess a woman's desire, a woman's subjectivity, and gender identity. But penetration was not the foundation of inversion. Inverts could have insertive sex with women, but they would still be considered inverts. Inversion has to do more with a personal style, with gender performance. One who is an invert violates the protocols of their gender, to such an extent that this cannot be reversed even if you have sexual relations with people of the opposite sex. This might seem a little bit like effeminacy, but there is a key difference. Consider, for example, male inverts. The effeminate male likes women, enjoys being in their company. The male invert wants to be a woman. Right? That's a key distinction. Of course, both are soft, and as this suggests, in pre-modern European cultures at least, the specter of gender often haunted all of normal or normative masculinity. Effeminates were those who succumbed to the temptations that all men faced. On the other hand, inverts were those who had fallen so far into the life of the other gender that they are seen to have a constitutional defect. They're part of a minoritized community. Of course, pederasts or inverts cannot be identified by looking at them, whereas inverts can. Their gestures, their demeanor, their attitudes, their manner of comportment, they all suggest gender deviance. To be short, inversion manifests itself outwardly. Of all of the categories that we've talked about so far, the one that seems closest to our modern day concept of homosexuality is probably inversion. But nevertheless, inversion is not the same as homosexuality. Inversion was an idea that was pioneered and popularized by 19th and early 20th century sexologists. And when they talked about it, they often defined it as contrary sexual feeling. And when they used this term, contrary sexual feeling, they did so to signal their belief that inverts felt that they actually belonged to the sex opposite their own, having a feminine attitude and an attraction to women, even though you're born a male. That is to say, sexologists did not distinguish systematically between sexual deviance and gender deviance. Same-sex sexual object choice was a symptom of having an inverted sex role. That is to say, gender deviance was understood to be at the heart of the matter, the root cause. This is unlike our modern concept of homosexuality. Also, unlike our modern concept of homosexuality, inversion said nothing about the sexual partners of the invert. They were not assumed to be abnormal, problematic, or deviant themselves. Okay, so homosexuality, the last of our 5 categories. The term first appeared in print in 1869 in a pamphlet by the Austrian journalist Karl Maria Kertzbeny. Originally, it simply referred to those whose sexual drive was directed toward persons of the same sex. That's it. It was minimalistic. Because of this, it was incredibly adaptable. That is why today, homosexuality has encompassed a number of earlier different conceptual models of sexuality, and it often combines them. It includes 3 key components. First, a psychiatric notion of orientation, which suggests that the individual's inner life is inverted. However, that does not necessarily imply or require same-sex sexual behavior. Second, a psychoanalytic notion of same-sex sexual object choice or desire, which is derived from Freud. And third, a sociological notion of sexually deviant behavior. Talking about this and what defines homosexuality, what makes it different from some of these earlier forms, David Halperin writes as follows, quote, "Neither a notion of orientation, nor a notion of object choice, nor a notion of behavior alone is sufficient to generate the modern definition of homosexuality. Rather, the notion seems to depend on the conjunction of all 3. Homosexuality is at once a psychological condition, an erotic desire, and a sexual practice." Of course, this refers to both partners in a relationship, not just one. As the mid-20th century sex researcher Alfred Kinsey put it, all that is required for homosexuality is same-sex sexual contact. This is in fact quite a revolutionary idea. First, because under the aegis of homosexuality, gender and gender roles are relatively unimportant. Sexual object choice is entirely detached from gender identity. This makes it possible to ascribe the term to people whose styles and outward gender appearance are perfectly normative. Secondly, homosexuality implies eroticism, but not in a way that requires hierarchy. Homosexuality implies that it is possible for people to bond on the basis of sameness, not difference. And those 2 differences are key to understanding what makes homosexuality different from some of these earlier instances and categories of same-sex sexual desire and behavior. So I hope this helped to clarify some things. Of course, if you have questions, feel free to ask. We could talk about this a lot more.